Perry Mason takes on a case that is 25 years old, Chapter 6. Fred Field had put down the phone after talking to Mrs. Mason. Although he knew that he could be facing potential murder charges, he now felt more comfortable knowing that Perry Mason was at least willing to talk to him. The problem was, though, Fred had spent the last 20 years wondering himself what had happened that night. The guilt that he had carried all these years had been tremendous. At the home, he had been a subject that they did not speak of. He knew for many years that his wife had suspected that something had happened the night before Ralph had disappeared. She had noticed right away that he was wearing a new shirt when he came home. Then when she found the ripped shirt that he had thrown in the trash, she had been very interested, to say the least. For years, that old shirt had been hidden in the garage. He had, for some reason, held on to it, partly from guilt and partly because he knew that if it was just a cross that he was to bear, so to speak. He was sure that Jane didn't know that he had it hid away above the breezeway where there were two entrances onto the ceiling. It was hard to get to, as you needed a ladder or needed to climb the side of the wall yourself. That day, Fred left the office early. He needed to talk to his kind-hearted wife, Jane, and tell her everything that he could remember about the night and what had happened. There were very little that she didn't know, but it was his hope that she would go with him to the city to see Perry Mason. He knew that it was a lot for him to ask of her, but he wanted her to stand by his side if she would. Tom and Marcus had finally had something to work with. They thought about the two state troopers who had been involved in the original investigation, but there was a problem with that. It had been 20 years. Steve no longer was a detective. He was the captain of the Leominster State Police Barracks, and Mike retired to Florida about 5 years ago. When the murder had first happened, everything was still done by hand, and there were very few computers. The town was a small town, and most of the evidence had not yet been put into the central system. So unfortunately, Marcus and Tom found themselves going between the computer and handwritten notes. Although most of the notes had been written by his own handwriting, his handwriting left something to be desired, and he wished he had practiced more when he was young. Initially, there had been several suspects. As time went on, people had been able to provide alibis on where they were the night before or where they were in the morning of the day that Ralph had disappeared. There were other people that had been involved in the bar that evening, other than Fred also. Most of them still were in town, and two of them still worked for the same factory with Fred. This is when the two officers decided to make some calls and speak to those who were still in the area. They didn't want to draw much attention to themselves, so they would wait for the two men and wait until Fred had left the office. Chris Martin was one of those men that had been around the day that Ralph had disappeared. He was surprised to get a call from the police. He had lived in the town for all his life and knew both Tom and Marcus well. The murder of Ralph Walden had happened so long ago, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of new evidence the police had come upon to reopen the case. As he walked into the police station, he knew that it was time for him to tell everything he knew. Both Tom and Marcus were sitting at the desk and stood up and shook his hand. Chris was nervous, but he took a deep breath, and after he saw them turn on the recorder, he knew he was being officially interrogated. There had been talk about Fred getting a big bonus at work because of the sale. The story also was that the bank manager who denied the loan, had received a large chunk of change from the company in exchange for the denial. It was said that without that loan, his company would have gone out of business. Their company was the biggest competitor with the company that took over the business, and there was a lot of money involved. Marcus and Tom listened to Chris, who had always known at homes, and thanked the men for the information. Of course, what Chris had said was just what could be considered rumors or gossip, but perhaps there was something there after all. That is what they would need to find out. As the men came in and out of the police station, Tom and Marcus heard the same story over and over. Very soon, after Ralph was killed, it seemed that Fred had a lot of money. He had bought a new car and a home on the hill in the better part of town. Also, there was the bank manager who had retired quietly and moved out of town, and it was said that he had bought a very fancy condo. Jane was in her kitchen when she heard Fred's car in the driveway. This was a strange time for him to come home. He rarely came home during the day, as she was sure that he had a visit from the police, and he was coming home to talk to her. As Fred came into the house, he told his wife, Jane, that they needed to talk. He told her everything, and she listened intently. She agreed to go with him to see Perry Mason. Honey, I don't believe you murdered Ralph. You've never even spanked the kids. No, but perhaps Perry Mason and the famous detective agency Paul Drake can find the real murderer, and you and I can finally rest peacefully. End of chapter 6.